I think people are still coming in. We stopped a little late before lunch, but we'll try to catch up. A few things to say. I think really from the very beginning of today, talking to Ogden, education has really been at the core, more or less, of everything we've been talking about. Formal education and informal education. Ideas of what normal looks like, what stereotype looks like. Ogden talked about the fact that brainwashing was a terrifying thing, from the most extreme versions of that, just to the inculcation of attitudes that make you think, this is who I am or should be, and this is who they are or should be. And how you unlearn things that you have learned in order to learn new things, I think is a very powerful and complex idea. In putting on the Being a Man Festival, and this is its first year, and I'm saying first year because the response has been so overwhelmingly enthusiastic that I'm just unilaterally announcing another one for next year. We want that, don't we? We want that, yes. But I just very interestingly done a quick news night interview. And I want you to go away, if you've had a good day at the end of this, and if you're staying for the weekend, please go out on an anti-sneer campaign. It is not appropriate to sneer at men for wanting to talk about a changing landscape. It's not appropriate to say that men don't deserve support in thinking about how to deal with complex issues. And it's certainly not appropriate, as one interviewer just said to me, to say, oh yes, I suppose they'll be doing this in Macclesfield next, won't they? As if northern men, for some reason, would have less interest, aptitude or sensitivity to deal with the issues of change. And this general idea that this is a sort of self-indulgent talking shop for metrosexual men who've been growing beards recently, even though there will be some delightfully in the audience, I hope, this is rubbish. Intelligent people of all ages and backgrounds and class deserve and need platforms to make social change happen. And somebody said this morning, the personal is political, and it is. Complicated phrase, that in itself. Please make sure that you go and see the market at some stage, which has all the groups who are working in forums, in Survivors UK, the Great Initiative, Young Dads Councils. All of that market is on the ballroom floor in the Royal Festival Hall. And at 5:30 you've got the free Friday tonic, so after all of this you can just go and sort of let your hair down there. But on the 7th of March we have an open space as part of the Women of the World Festival to talk about what does gender equality look like in primary education. And it's for anybody who is interested in primary education and who thinks they want to contribute. Open space meaning you set your own agenda on that, so put that in your diaries if you would. So turning to this session now, which specifically on education, the chair of this is Henry Ward. Henry Ward is the new head of education at Southbank Centre. We have a very large and significant part of our work through learning and participation, led by Sean McLennan. But this whole territory of liaison with formal education is something which we've appointed Henry. I think he's on day 20. I think you've lost about a stone and some hair since you arrived. But prior to working here, for the last 13 years at Welling School, he was a specialist visual arts teacher. And he undertook a variety of roles, but he was recently the deputy head teacher. And that relationship between visual arts as a specialisation and the whole school curriculum really changed the way the school was able to do its thinking. He founded a biannual periodical, a free newspaper called A, concentrating on art and education. And he's written widely and lectured widely on the whole relationship between creativity and progress. And he recently completed his PhD with Middlesex University and himself is a practicing artist. I'm going to leave him to introduce the panel, but I would like just to say Vanessa Ogden, who's here, has worked with me on WOW for nearly 4 years now, as Mulberry School have. Hello, Mulberry School. So you couldn't have finer women's brains than those women out there thinking about how to support women and men to make change. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude, and thank you for all coming to this debate, which I hope is going to be a really interesting debate about boys' education. Jude's given me a really lovely welcome there, so I'm not going to say anything more about myself, but I would like to go on and introduce the panel. So we're very fortunate in having Vanessa here, as you heard, as head of Mulberry Girls' School. And we've also got two other head teachers. We've got Ruth Holden, who is head teacher of Bonas School in Lewisham, and we've got Steve Parsons, who's the head teacher of Langley School for Boys. And Steve was very kindly brought along. I think particularly honoured to have two of his sixth formers with us. This is Jazz and Tom, who are also going to take part in the discussion this afternoon. Before I'm going to ask Vanessa actually to start with a little bit of an idea about some perspectives on boys' education from the perspective of a head teacher of a very successful girls' school. But before I do that, I'd just like to set a little bit of an idea really of what we're talking about when we talk about the situation in boys' education. A few figures for you. Primary education to start with, and we don't actually have a primary head on the panel this afternoon, but of course we've all been through primary education and we're all dealing with the impact of what happens in primary education. And currently in this country, only 8% of the workforce in primary schools are male. It's quite a frightening number. It's even more frightening if you go to early years. It's only 3% in nursery schools are male. And even in secondary schools, it's only 36% of the workforce that are male. So we can see that there's an arguably almost a feminisation of our education system. And I think one of the things that would be interesting to unpick a little this afternoon is what impact that might be having. There was a report recently called Closing Doors, which talked about the impact of what it was called gender bias in our schools, that despite moving away from a time not that long ago, generationally, where girls would be sent off to do knitting and sewing while the boys were doing woodwork, we still have a situation where there is a gender bias, particularly at A-level. And we find that there are still more girls opting for biology, English and psychology than boys, and there are still more boys opting for physics, maths and economics than girls. Perhaps another thing we could touch on a little is why that might be. So I'd like to hand over first of all to Vanessa to give us a little bit of an idea of some ideas she's having about what we could do about boys' education. And we'll leave about 10 minutes or so at the end for questions from some of you, I hope. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's true that my school at the moment is a girls' school, and I'm enormously privileged to work in a girls' school as a head teacher. I feel enormously privileged to do so. Before that, I also taught and was a leader in 3 co-educational schools, and my experience as a young person was also co-educational. So it was very interesting to be able to go and work in a school where I could actually, with my staff, with my deputies, with my senior team, and all the rest of the staff and the students, actually start from the point of creating a really fantastic, the best education that you would want a young woman to have. And what the end point of that might be, so having the power of choice out in the world, given all of the kinds of social and economic issues that there are for women and the need to have flexibility, and to really think about that end point and then build a provision which allows our young women to be able to leave and be able to manage themselves in the world in a way which is going to make them happiest and most successful. And I suppose I've told you that really because it's actually about how, as a leader, you start to think about your school and you start to think about the people in it, the community, the context that they're in, you know, whether they're boys or girls or whether they are girls and boys, and actually structure everything so that that those people, those young people, can have the best life possible as a result of the education that you've provided. So I think it makes for very, very interesting thinking, and that's why I was really interested in being part of the panel today. Because if you're a head of a co-educational school like my colleague Ruth, and if you're a head of a boys' school like my colleague Steve, you know, there are equally very interesting things to think about, because actually, in a sense, what we're really doing as heads and school leadership teams is starting from that basic point. In the society that we're in, with all the pressures that it has, how do we enable people, boys or girls, to flourish? So I'd kind of like to leave it there, really, and let my colleagues kind of take over.
Perhaps, Ruth, if we can go on to your perspective from a co-ed head.
Good afternoon, everyone. have to say I was thinking about this on the way in and thinking, you know, I grew up, I went to a co-ed school myself. I have 3 older brothers, and I had quite a male-dominated upbringing, and then, of course, spent some time in banking, which was very male-dominated, and now in education. And all the schools I've worked in have been predominantly male-dominated in terms of student population and staff. The school that I'm currently in, it's very interesting listening to colleagues from single-sex schools. I have about 60% boys at my school at the moment. That's mainly because where the school is has several single-sex schools around it. And quite often, families opt for their daughter to go to the girls' school, and then I will get the boys from the family. And that's quite interesting dynamic. So I concur with everything that Vanessa has said in terms of ensuring that every student gets the best education. We have toyed in the school with having single-sex English, Maths and Science classes, just in core subjects. We have opted against that, but it's a continuous discussion in terms of what goes on in the classroom in front of you with boys and girls in the classroom. The world is co-ed, and so when you work in a co-ed school, I'm mindful that all the time it's about endorsing how girls and boys interact with each other so that they can go on to the world of work, to universities, to the world of work, and have natural relationships with each other, and that wouldn't stop achievement post-school. I was talking earlier as well about the fact that in my school, 70% of the students have an absent father. And that makes an interesting dynamic for the men in the school, and there are mainly male teachers at the school, and their relationships with the boys and the girls at the school. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes the male teachers and the male members of staff are the role model for the students. And that's therefore very important that their behaviour, it's key in how boys and girls will go out into the world. So that's just an interesting perspective from my point of view.
Thank you, Ruth. Steve, if we could go to the boys' perspective.
Yeah, indeed. Good afternoon. My career path has followed a similar one to Vanessa, actually. So for the first 15 years of my teaching career, I worked in a variety of mixed inner London comprehensives, and I took over as the head teacher at Langley Park School for Boys just this last September. And having gone from mixed schools, there is a different feel which I think is tangible in a school which is all boys. We have a mixed sixth form, so we have girls in the sixth form, but years 7 to 11 it's boys, and there is a different dynamic, particularly around certain subjects. So I think in the mixed schools where maybe there was a tendency for certain subjects, for example maybe drama or dance, to have attracted more girls than boys, there are no issues at all with the boys doing those subjects at the school, and we have an absolutely superb performing arts department where we have entire cohorts of boys taking part in musical productions in a way that I just don't think they would have done in mixed schools. And it's clearly it's not about the school. I mean, my job as the head teacher obviously is to create a culture in which the boys want to achieve and want to do the best that they can. But it's very obvious to me that it's a far wider issue in terms of how boys and girls and men and women are seen in society. And I think maybe we've made progress in breaking down the stereotypes, but they are still there. I think in the mixed schools, my experience certainly was that there is an expectation that boys will be louder and will be more boisterous. More teachers' time is spent dealing with boys in a mixed school than with girls. And society says that girls are the quieter ones who will cause less trouble and who will get on with their work and who will have neater handwriting. And I think these issues still exist. Even though we've come a long way in trying to break down these stereotypes, it's still there in the background. So it's been a very interesting experience for me to actually see boys and to see how they behave differently when the girls are not there beside them. They don't feel obliged to act in a particular way. And they still play rugby, and there's still a sort of a degree, I guess, of laddish behaviour, but the attitude to work is different. There isn't a need to try and impress anyone. So in lessons, and I know I've only been there about 4 months, but my feeling is the boys take the studies more seriously because there is less distraction. And it's a very interesting picture that's emerging, and maybe it goes some way towards explaining the sort of trend where single-sex schools have tended over the years to outperform mixed schools. But it's interesting, but I'm very clear that what's happening in schools, by the time they join me at the age of 11 in secondary school, they've had 10 or 11 years of being exposed to society where many of these sort of stereotypes are already ingrained in terms of what they should go on to do. So I think we need to start before we get to secondary school in order to fully address these issues.
Thank you, Steve. I think there's already been several very interesting points raised that I'd like to go into in a bit more depth. Before we do that, it'd be very interesting if we could have Tom and then Jazz's perspective on going through a single-sex education. I appreciate there are girls in your sixth form, boys, but you've had 5 years of just being boys, so perhaps, Tom, first of all, you could say a little bit.
Okay, well, I can certainly endorse Mr. Parsons' statement that young women in the class is fairly distracting. I am not exactly masculine. I mean, I have the parts, but I play music. I strenuously avoid the rugby pitch, but I can see that these ideals are certainly evident in boys' education. I also think that the split between the jocks, if you like, and those doing arts and the dance and things, I think that would happen in any school, co-ed or otherwise. And in co-ed schools, it splits down the ready-made lines of boys and girls, whereas in somewhere like Langley, that's not an issue. My personal experience from a boys' school is that it's quite a liberating experience. You don't have that additional pressure, which is possibly more evident in a co-ed school.
Thank you, Tom. And Jazz?
Yeah, well, personally, I have 2 sisters, so I've sort of had the feminine sort of side growing up. But I definitely see a difference in sixth form where the girls that have joined are all really smart. There's no doubt about that. I think that might be because I found that girls have a better work ethic than boys, potentially. I'm not sure why this is, but it's evident lower down the school because younger girls mature much more quickly than boys do. And I still consider myself quite immature. However, I would say that the fact that girls mature more quickly sort of enables them to set their sights and perform better in schools as they go through and set objectives which they can achieve.
Thank you. I think if we can pick up on that point then, and I'd like to go back to something Ruth said about the role that perhaps the male staff play as role models with absent fathers, and perhaps we could focus a little bit on what happens at primary, because I think Jazz's point about maturity is a really interesting one. I think we perhaps have to accept that without any absolute scientific facts at my fingertips, that girls do mature faster than boys. If we can kind of not have a big discussion about it, but accept that maybe that's true, that what impact does that have, do we think, at primary school, given some of the points that have been raised there? Perhaps start with Ruth.
Yeah, I think I'm very lucky at the school that I'm at. Well, it's partly luck and it's partly the work we do with staff. That the men at my school, even though they're very authoritative, are also very gentle and always, particularly when students can challenge. Young people do challenge, sometimes in appropriate ways and sometimes not. We talk a lot about this amongst the staff, and you know, if there's no male at home showing the behaviours that are to model for the world, for the young person to go out into the world, then it's very important schools are doing that job. So yes, it's important to deliver the curriculum. Of course, that's important, and you know, every student needs to leave school having made good or outstanding progress and to have achieved a set of results to take them into a place where they can choose what they want to do in the world. But what's even more important is that sort of citizenship, those social standards, social behaviour. And school is the place sometimes that those students learn those things properly. It may not be modelled at home. What I've noticed at my school is, it's very interesting, I have an all-male English department and an all-female maths department. And that's really interesting in terms of how those subjects are delivered. Probably haven't got time, I mean, you could write a thesis on that. But the way students access maths and English being taught, I just think gender is one of the most interesting things. Achievement, progress is made because of relationships. The most important thing in life is the conversation between, you know, two people, and an adult and a student. A student to feel safe, comfortable, able to ask questions. Those are all important. And so it is how the staff act towards students. I often worry that when I'm walking around the school, you know, setting standards, that I'm just seen as a bit of a nag, particularly by the boys, because I think that's what happens at home. They live with their mum, there's an auntie, possibly a grandmother, and I am just seen, they see me a bit like that. Whereas they see the men as something maybe that they haven't, you know, it's quite interesting being a female head teacher in a predominantly male environment. So to unpick all of that is interesting. But I've always found it interesting that my female maths teachers, and there are 9 of them, delivering maths to predominantly boys, and maths is high attaining at my school.
Thank you. I don't know who else would like to come in on this as a point here. I think it's interesting because we are coming in the 3 perspectives we've got from a secondary perspective. What you're saying there about the role model and the role model for citizenship issues. There's also, of course, the personification of the teacher, and I think that boys seeing men and women in secondary schools being in that role, but very rarely seeing men in that role in primary schools. So what do we think the impact might be on very young boys seeing education as being something which isn't for men? I don't know who'd like to come into this.
I mean, I know there have been a number of studies around why there are not more male primary school teachers, but also there have been studies about the impact of the fact that students are taught predominantly by women. And in terms of the hard educational outcomes, in terms of the sort of progress and attainment of students in primary schools, there is no evidence at all to suggest that students who have more male teachers do better than students who have a very female dominated schooling at primary school. So it's not necessarily about the learning and progress. I think that the role model and the male role model argument around primary education, it's not about results. It has to be about something which is harder, I think, to put your finger on. Yes, I'm sure it is good to have positive male role models in school, particularly in families where maybe there are not positive male role models at home. But in terms of outcomes, it doesn't have an impact. So it's hard to quantify the difference that it makes. But there are a number of reasons, I think. I mean, studies have sort of shown that there are 3 main reasons why men tend to not be so keen to go into primary education. And one of them, again, is the main one is just around the society norm that says that women are the caring, nurturing types, and therefore when children are very young and they have runny noses and all of that kind of stuff, it's the caring, nurturing woman that would look after them at school. Interestingly, and I think a reflection of our time, that this was evidence from a sort of survey of people applying to teacher training courses. Many men also expressed concern that they might be accused of some kind of inappropriate behaviour if they were teaching young children. They felt nervous or exposed that kind of thing might happen. And I think that's very off-putting for some of them as well. So I think there's a number of reasons why men are not going to primary education. But as I said, in terms of outcomes, it doesn't seem to make a difference. It's about the more social aspects of what men bring in terms of modelling good behaviour. That's what I think is most important.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa?
Yes, I'm going to say something which I think might be a little bit controversial. I don't know. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I was just reflecting while Steve was talking about why it is that perhaps maybe so many men don't go into teaching, and perhaps it's something about how the profession is viewed, possibly even about pay. And here we're starting to get into the area of women's pay and men's pay and equality issues, the way in which teachers have sometimes been seen. I read a study in the 1970s about the fact that at the time, if you were a teacher and a woman, this was before the 70s, but not too much before, once you got married, you couldn't any longer be a teacher. Because actually it was viewed to be the case that you would then become, your work patterns would become less stable because you'd have children and so on. And so there's something about how the profession is, perhaps the changes that in the way that people have viewed the profession, because that certainly wasn't the case before then, when it was quite a male-dominated profession. So I think there are some interesting things about the value we place on young people and the way in which they're educated and the importance of that. And the whole status of schooling in that respect, when actually really, young people are our future. I mean, they are the people who will make decisions about our own care when we're elderly and not able to work anymore. And so if we want a society that's fair, civilization really is created in our schools. And so I do think that as a society we need to maybe think more carefully about the way in which we structure our system. I think as head teachers and teachers, I'm not sure that the gender necessarily within schools makes a difference, certainly to progress and attainment. I think the way in which staff are trained is particularly important. Ruth talks a lot about professional development, and I think we work very carefully with all our staff at Mulberry in relation to training, but particularly in induction, because there are quite specific things that you need to be aware of in your behaviour in order to ensure that we're modelling the right expectations for all young people. There's something there, there's some key issues there about society, I think.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on something actually though about the idea of how quantifiable the impact might be, because I think it's almost an unquantifiable thing. If we're accepting, as I think we are, that there is a difference between boys' achievement and a growing difference between boys' achievement and girls' achievement, if we take out the kind of complexities of whether it's co-ed or single sex at post-11, there is a problem of boys struggling to achieve academically to the same degree as girls. And I sort of posit the question really, could it be that the feminisation of early years education, the role models of women being seen as educators and very few men being seen as educators, does have that kind of impact? And I'd like to couple that in with another question to all of you about whether the kind of increased compression, so to speak, of the curriculum, the desire for more academic achievement at an ever earlier age is also having this kind of impact, that the move away from opportunities to play to a more reading and writing as early as possible perhaps doesn't suit boys. If we go back to the point Jazz was making about maturity, that if boys are perhaps less able to access these things at an earlier age and they're being told to do these sooner by predominantly females, is this something that's making them switch off slightly from academic learning? I don't know who'd like to come in first on that.
I'll make a quick point. Is it possible that it's not so much perhaps that boys necessarily mature slower than girls, but that from an early age, boys are, be it kind of subconsciously or otherwise, boys are encouraged to go out and play, whereas girls are perhaps encouraged to be less active and concentrate on reading. So in a way, girls kind of have an unfair head start. They might start reading earlier, and reading definitely has a large impact on attention span, just general vocabulary.
I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, definitely.
I think that the reading thing is absolutely key, and the difference between the percentage of boys and percentage of girls achieving A stars to C for GCSE English back in 2013, it was something like 73% of girls and about 64% of boys. There's a very significant gap. Girls are reading and writing better than boys, and I think Tom is absolutely right that probably, again, that's something which has begun well before they get to secondary school. There is an expectation that boys will go out and play football or rugby and climb trees and all of that kind of stuff, whereas there is probably more inclination for the girl to be at home, to be reading. And obviously I'm not saying that's right, but I think that is the way it is, and it does essentially mean that they've had more schooling by the time they join school.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know that the government has, there's been changes to education policy, and we can talk about the EBAC and all those sorts of things, but actually, I think schools do still have a tremendous amount of opportunity to structure the way in which they teach the curriculum and the way in which they create that education space. And therefore an enormous amount can be done to ensure that what we are doing in our society is creating a partnership of equals. I think, that I'm at the moment with my colleagues, we're looking at setting up a new school, a university technical college, which some of you may know what those are, but they are provisions which actually specialise in technical learning at university and high level, really high technical prowess. Now, that will be a co-educational provision, and we're all at Mulberry very excited by that possibility, but particularly because it's an opportunity to take the curriculum and from scratch really create something that is going to enable boys and girls to flourish as partners, as equals. So I think when you have those opportunities to start from scratch, that makes it easier. But equally, as a head and a staff, what you create, it's down to you. It's the people that matter. It's the way in which they work that really matter. So I think it's about how, as a school system, we take on all of these difficulties and work within our school environments to create resolution.
Ruth, would you like to come in on that?
Yes. In the school that I'm in at the moment, girls outperform boys at 5 A star to C with maths and English by, I think it's been roughly 2% for the last 4 years. And this year, the last lot of results, it was slightly more than that. However, the top 10 performers this year were 8 boys and 2 girls. And also, when I looked at the A and A star data, boys had outperformed girls. So I have a situation at my school where at certain benchmarks, girls and boys both outperform each other. There are more boys, so as a school, I always want boys to do better because there's more of them. But I think it's interesting about how things are delivered. I go back to the point I made about my maths and English departments. Men delivering poetry, men modelling the love of Shakespeare, of being in role as, various characters of Shakespeare. And in fact, my 3 drama teachers, 2 are male as well. And I just think that has an impact. I'd like you all to sort of reflect upon your own learning experience. If you take yourself back to school, which teachers do you remember? Which subjects were you good at and why? If you ask yourself those questions, you will probably find, as I do, that it goes back to the human relationship between you and the teacher. There is nothing else that matters. I know that I don't speak French and I'm not particularly confident with maths exams because of the 2 teachers that I had. Not because I was born not good at those things. Obviously, you are born with certain parts of your brain maybe working better in certain places. But if you are told that you're good at something, and if somebody models that for you, that's success. And so, that's the message that has to go into schools. That's the message that staff have to going every day, delivering. And I'm so proud of the male drama and English teachers at my school, because they've made boys love English and drama. I'm afraid, you know, statistically, I buck the trend nationally at my school with boys' achievement in English and those subjects. Girls are good at maths. So, you know, I do understand all the discussions. We're not particularly scared of the new framework coming in about curriculum. The only thing that is an issue for us is that early entry, because some people do need twice to pass a test. I mean, some people do need to take their driving test a few times before they pass. I don't see a problem with some early entry and retakes, as long as students leave with the qualification that they should get. That will impact on our boys, because they do like to know, it would seem, quick wins. They do like to know, right, I've got that in the bag, I can now go for something else. That taking away of the early entry will have impact on my school. But then again, it's for everyone, so everyone will have impact. So that's
Vanessa?
You mentioned something, and Steve mentioned this as well, about curriculum subjects and the way in which young people choose, you know, and the sort of this idea that there are boys' subjects and girls' subjects. I think that's a real issue for co-educational schools particularly, because, you know, again, at my school, you know, we just don't have those issues around certain subjects being seen to be sort of off limits because of gender. So, I mean, I'd be interested to sort of hear a bit more, perhaps, about from Jazz and from Tom about, you know, those kinds of issues. Because I think subject selection then sort of creates scenarios later on in life, doesn't it? So.
Well, I would say there are certain subjects which are predominantly taken by girls or boys. For example, I take A-level German, and in my German class there's about 10 of us, and there's a 50-50 split. However, if you take into consideration that 2/3 of our sixth form is boys and only a third is girls, you can see that perhaps that more girls delve into subjects like English and languages further, whereas boys predominantly take subjects like engineering, physics and economics. And another example of this is engineering from AS. There's out of a class of around 13 students, there's only one girl taking AS engineering, and I think that's quite important.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but also one kind of endorsement of single-sex schooling is that the so-called kind of girly subjects of music and English are taken by people like me. So that split is possibly not as defined in a single-sex school as in somewhere co-ed. Although that there is a kind of reverse to that, and Jazz mentioned that things like engineering. Where, you know, I think I'd be right in saying a boys' school is more likely to have perhaps the facilities or the teachers which would encourage people, students, to continue with engineering and enjoy it, whereas at a girls' school there might not be that emphasis. So it's, you know, it's in the kind of classroom subjects. The single sex is possibly beneficial, whereas in things like sport or engineering, possibly not so much.
Although, just to follow on from that, I mean, it's interesting again, but if you look at the results from last summer at the GCSEs, girls are now outperforming boys in every single subject except maths. So even subjects which in the past have very much been a male domain, for example physics, the girls are outperforming boys in those subjects now. And we may well have read, I'm sure many people read this morning, UCAS applications that have gone in this year, people applying to university. This year, 58% of applications that have gone into universities this year are from women. There are far more women now going on to university than men. So things have changed a lot, and it seems that moving forward they're changing still. And I think that all of the things that we've mentioned play a part: the home, the background, the schooling, the teachers. I agree entirely with what Ruth said about people remember the good teacher. In fact, there was an advert on TV when they were running a teacher recruitment campaign a few years ago, I seem to remember, where various celebrities popped up and said the name of their favourite teacher. And I think that is important, and what was said about the relationships with the teacher is very important. The support they get at home, the stability at home and encouragement at home is important. I think there are many factors at play.
Can I just, we're going to probably have about 5 more minutes before we go to questions, so I'd just like to throw something else in there about perhaps what can we do to address those things you're talking about there, Steve, of the fact that there is a gap that's opening up and getting bigger all the time between the achievement of boys and girls. And as an aside to that, this is possibly a slightly controversial question, but do we think that the drive back towards linearity, which in some quarters is suggested will favour boys for that idea of a final exam as opposed to modules and coursework, which supposedly favour girls who are perhaps considered to be more diligent as they work their way through the course? Boys will cram at the end. I'm throwing out things I know are going to cause some problems here, but perhaps we could just, is that going to change this picture? Or
it's, I mean, the things that you've just said, I know there have been studies which suggest that, or people think that the terminal exam will favour boys who are very good at putting in 3 months of hard graft at the end. The previous 18 months they've done very little. I mean, I think your original question about how do we change this, it comes back to what Vanessa said right at the beginning. It's about the culture that is created within the school, and I've said that it's my job as the head teacher of the school to create a culture where learning is a good thing and the boys want to learn. And it's easy to say, it's harder to do. It requires all of your staff to be working together. You have to challenge and attack the sort of stereotypes that exist. I was, again, just thinking about it on the way in, even if you sort of consider any average American teen film, which is based in a high school, it's the cool kids who get the girlfriends and who everybody likes are the ones who play sport and who are macho. And the boys who are studious are the ones who are always depicted with the big silly glasses and a bit bumbling. And we are trying to battle against that culture which is around us. And it's our job as head teachers in schools to do it. But it's difficult when factors outside of the school are still portraying these ridiculous stereotypes.
Vanessa, I know you're itching to get in here.
Yes. I mean, I think there is mythology as well, actually, around the fact that girls have suddenly started to do better. In the 80s, there was a big push, 90s actually, in the 90s. When I started teaching, girls didn't do better than boys. It was the other way around. And that was put down to the linearity of examinations and lack of coursework at that time. I'm not sure about some of these statistics, actually. I mean, I have read research from the 60s where it showed quite clearly that the number of girls that were allowed to go to grammar school, so in terms of the 11 plus, girls did better in the 11 plus than boys, and so their places were capped. So that actually, boys, that there were equal numbers in the grammar school system, but actually girls were then at that point outperforming. So I think it's very complex. Nobody's really, I think, actually done enough research to pin down exactly what influences success at the end in terms of learning style and what's appropriate. I do think that there are some very, very entrenched issues, entrenched stereotypes around girls and their performance, around girls and the way in which they're viewed, around the fact that one assumes that girls will just find it easier to do coursework and be more diligent and be more quiet. I think my girls will say that's not the case. I'm certain they will. And that actually there are things about the way in which we expect young people to conform to these things, which then sets up whole sets of issues for learning, which you can break down in schools and which we are trying to break down. But again, as Steve says, it's kind of you're fighting against this. It's like swimming up a waterfall sometimes. you know, sexual exploitation out there. It's a big, big problem. The way in which girls have to deal with image and grapple with all those things that are thrown at them. You know, it's just not fair on young people, and we should, as a society, be much more mature about it.
Ruth?
Right, well, it's huge, and you know, but I think also boys suffer from all sorts of entrenched views and expectations of them. It's so interesting. I love being in a co-ed school. I love the vibe and the chemistry between boys and girls. The boys, I'm afraid, are more immature in years 7 and 8. You see the girls walking by, you know, they're more into certain conversations, and the boys are still running up to them saying, "Yeah, you've got a spot," you know, and you know, and they're just like, whatever. But eventually, they all reach year 11 through all the thick and thin of it, and they reach year 11, and they go to that end of year ball, that end of year prom, and they all look beautiful, and young ladies and men, and I think there's something very healthy. Sorry, colleagues and students, about co-ed education, because it's the world, and you have to sit next to somebody, and you have to find your way of working through the distractions of looking at somebody that's not of your gender. Just one thing that's really interesting, just going back to curriculum, we just had a new build, and we never had food technology in the school, and it's just come in as part of our new build. And it was really interesting when we said, right, you know, this is in the options now, you can choose this as a subject. And it was really interesting. Nearly all boys chose it. There weren't as many girls as boys chose it for a GCSE. And as we know, most of the well-known, wealthy, on-television chefs are male. And yet at home, for my students, it's the mum at home cooking. And I have a predominantly West African population at my school. So I just found that quite an interesting experiment for us to introduce this new topic of food technology. So, but yeah.
Thank you. I think perhaps at that moment it might be good to go out to questions. We can have the guy in the purple just there, please.
Just might be interesting that thing about with Tom and Ash about that thing of girls coming in at 16 to get their view on that in terms of whether that's any problematic in any way. They think. Just another thing, I had a quick look at your website. It's very, in terms of your, the musical thing, it's very interesting that your school had obviously chosen to do Hairspray, which was the great John Waters film, the vehicle for the wonderful drag queen Divine. That's very nice in terms of that. But the other thing I wanted to say was just about when pupils arrive at the school, is there one thing that you would like to change that's come, you know, on the whole from the primary school education around, you know, obviously around this gender issue that we're discussing?
Who'd like to? Was that the? Do you want to say first of all, yeah, Tom does about the experience of going in with girls in the sixth form?
Well, sixth form's terrifying enough, but I personally feel that the period from kind of year 7 and year 8 up to about year 10 is one of great insecurity for any self-respecting teen. You've gone from suddenly being secure in your old school and your old friends, and you're suddenly thrown into a new school and expected to fend for yourself. You've grown up relatively quickly, and you feel that you no longer can rely on parents or perhaps teachers the way you once did. So everyone is kind of inwardly, at least I hope everyone, otherwise it's just me, inwardly terrified of doing anything wrong, of, you know, doing something which is incredibly socially unacceptable, but nobody's ever thought to mention it to you, probably because it was so obviously socially unacceptable that it didn't need explaining. But I I think that, yeah, until we finish GCSEs, that is the point when many people have found themselves, if you like. And I know I was, by the end of year 11, I was actually quite comfortable, which is really odd. But I was comfortable in my own skin as to who I was. And then when girls were introduced this year for me, I don't have so many personal insecurities all at once. It's like dealing with it in steps rather than all at the same time, which is just
horrible. Yeah, and in terms of the introduction of girls into the sixth form, I remember having this conversation with my English teacher in year 11, and he told us that when the girls come in, all the boys sit on one side, all the girls sit on one side, and everyone's just looking at each other, perplexed, like scared just to talk to each other. And that's exactly what happened. And after a couple months, you find yourself getting more comfortable, and now it's just a natural thing, because lower down the school, you're with your friends, you're with the boys. Like you interact a certain way with your friends and your boys, but when you're interacting with girls, you have to interact differently. You have to be a bit more sensitive, and there's some things you can say, and there are some things that you cannot say. So, in that regard, I think it's quite interesting, and I think it.
What are the things you can't say?
you don't want to know.
You can't say
No, just
them.
you find yourself trying to be slightly more mature in the way that you behave and respond, I would say.
Thank you. Perhaps we could have just from each of the three heads, very quickly before we go to another question, just one thing you'd like to be different when the students arrive from primary school, one thing you'd like to have already been addressed that perhaps you think you're addressing. Start with Steve.
Well, that's a big question. I mean, one of the issues for us is, and I'm sure it's the same for my head teacher colleagues as well, is that we take students from something like 45 different feeder primary schools, and there might be sort of 2 or 3 who give larger numbers than the others, but nonetheless students come from far and wide to join the secondary school, and that does mean that you actually take on students who have had 45 different experiences of learning, and so socially, academically, there are many ways when they join you where they are at different places, and they've had different levels of support and different levels of progress and so on. Now, there isn't a solution to that, but that's one of the issues I think that we have when they join, is that they come from such a wide range of schools with such a wide range of experiences, that when suddenly they are in one school where they are expected to conform to a particular set of rules and behaviours, it can prove more difficult for some than others.
Thank you.
I think I've sort of avoided the question, actually. But
That's all right. Ruth?
Again, it's difficult because they've had such a range of experiences, but when they leave me, I want them to have felt loved. I want them to feel that they individually have been noticed. I think it's really important that every student has their name said all the time. I think there's nothing worse than that student that just, you know, they're sort of average in some ways and they don't get their name said. So I want every student to be noticed. And the other thing is, I always say to parents when they're looking around all the secondary schools, say, if you send your child to us, they will be loved, they will be noticed, but your little baby that comes home and tells you everything, they will stop doing that because something called teenager happens where they stop talking and telling their parent what goes on. And so what they need is a school that walks in partnership with them, and that the communication with home, school and the student is really high on the agenda.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Well, I think we have really great primary schools, actually. I mean, I can only speak really from my own experience. I think our primary schools are fantastic. If there's one thing I'd really love, though, actually, coming from primary into secondary in my own particular context, as one of our primary schools, I'm sure the others do it, there's one that I've visited. It's a fantastic school if you ever get the chance to go there, in Tower Hamlets, called Sir William Burroughs. And on a Thursday afternoon, they have an afternoon of singing. And if you know, and the students, it's fantastic to go and be with the whole school all singing together. Song after song after song, they've become familiar with the music, you know, and it's in full voice with full confidence. And if every child could come into my school with that level of confidence and singing, able to sing like that, the literacy, the musicality in that, there's so many, you know, working together as a team, all those things in there in that moment. And I think it gives great confidence and poise. That's what I'd really love to see.
Thank you. If we go for another question, we'll go the lady just on the front here.
Thank you. I actually do remember my teacher, and her name was Mrs. Jenkins, English teacher. You just reminded me of her. At the end of that debate, at the end of that talk, Ruth just touched on race. And what was going through my mind during the whole of this talk was, we're talking about the division between girls and boys, but what about, let's cut it up even further, between the boys and the black Caribbean boys that the school tends to fail them? What do we think goes on there in secondary school, why that happens?
Well, you're absolutely right. We haven't touched upon that. And actually, the level at which schools have to drill down now is forensic. And actually, we've got so forensic that it comes a full circle and you say, it doesn't matter what your gender, what your ethnicity, or whether you're free school meals or not free school meals, you are an individual student with a set of circumstances, and that is what matters, because everything has to be reported in different breakdown, you know, you break down into different groups and that's reported. But actually what's really important is the individual child and understanding what their home life is like, what their culture is, what their, you know, if they have even a room at home to work in, whether they have access to IT, you know, all of those things. So to move this into that arena is a huge discussion. Actually, the dominant group of students at my school are male, black, West African students, and that is the main group of students at free school meal. So if you look at their achievement, as I said earlier, we do not fall in line with trend. Those students are our highest performing students. And that's something that we have looked at as to why that is at the school, and done a lot of work on that. But that's the current state of play at my school.
Vanessa?
And I mean, I think it is exactly that's about making sure that you see your children, really, because they become our children, our daughters, our sons. You know, you see them all as individuals. Yes, there is a group, but they have to be seen as individuals, and you have to make provision for individuals. And you know, and I think Ruth's example there about the way in which her school does that, you know, it does yield the progress that you need. I think the whole thing about ensuring that people are not invisible in your education provision is really important.
Thank you. Now I know we have got lots of other people who want to ask questions, but unfortunately we are running past the time we've been allotted, so we're going to have to stop there. But thank you very, very much to all our guests on stage here, and thank you very much for coming.